right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Fearcast. This is the podcast dedicated to OCD and anxiety spectrum disorders, and getting your life back. I'm your host, Kevin Foss, and I'm a licensed therapist specializing in OCD and anxiety disorders. Thank you all so much for joining me today. If you have a question for the podcast, go over to fearcastpodcast.com and send me a question over there by clicking on the Submit a Question link. You can also send an audio question over to me if you join me at Instagram. Send me a message over there and press the little microphone button there. I'm Fearcast Podcast over at the Instagrams. As I mentioned before, audio questions, if you record your voice, it does go to the top of the list of questions that will be answered, and you can answer those or send me those questions over at Instagram. And again, of course, doing that over at the pod or at fearcastpodcast.com. Send me the recorded audio, record your voice, send me the file over questions at fearcastpodcast.com. Anyways, plenty of ways. So I hope everybody is doing well. October is the craziest month. There's a 30-degree weather swing from last week to this week. Last week was like a lovely, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. This weekend, mid-90s. It's awful. Now, again, I can complain about anything. It's one of my spiritual gifts. I'm very good at it. I perhaps ought to not be as good at it, and yet here I am. Well, why don't I just jump into it today? So today is going to be a bit of a combination. I am going to be answering a question. I and the very special guest will be answering a question about moral scrupulosity. So this question was sent in a while ago, and I was lucky enough to get some time with the brilliant Jon Hershfield, who was able to share some insights about just what moral scrup is, how is it, why is it OCD, how does it differ from other types of OCD, how is it kind of permeating all other types of OCD or other subtypes of OCD. So this is a really fun conversation. I always love having Jon on. He seems to be the resident philosopher in regards to scrupulosity or to OCD, and I am 100% certain, as one can be, obviously, that he would say that he is not, and that is fine. I look forward to having that discussion with him next time he is on. So let me just tell you a little bit about Jon before we start this episode. So Jon Hershfield is the director of the Center for OCD and Anxiety, Sheppard Pratt's private pay outpatient treatment center for individuals with obsessive compulsive and anxiety-related disorder, and the director of the OCD program at The Retreat, where Sheppard Pratt offers residential treatment for those who can benefit from higher level of care. He is the author of 6 books on OCD and mindfulness and CBT. He is a regular featured speaker at mental health conferences and webinars, and is the curator and moderator of Sheppard Pratt's OCD and Anxiety lecture series. So without further ado, here is my conversation on moral scrupulosity with Jon Hershfield. All right. Well, Jon Hershfield, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast yet again.
Thanks for having me back. Always a pleasure.
Well, I roped you in, as we were talking about earlier, I roped you into talking about this, since I know that you have an appreciation for, affinity for, and especially special knowledge on moral scrup. You have a doubtful look on your face right now, but that's fine.
Well, I've been told this. I don't really know why. I think I've written some blogs and done some webinars and things like that. So that's the way this OCD specialty world is. If you're sort of noisy about a particular topic, people start pointing you out as the expert. But it's not like I've done any sort of special research or anything. I sometimes wonder if people think I know a lot about moral scrupulosity because I'm an especially compassionate and sensitive person. So when I'm working with people, I'm really, thinking about how they're relating to their self-worth and their role in society. Mm-hmm. Or maybe it's the opposite, where it's like they just think I'm like, Jon's kind of a sociopath. So I wonder if maybe there's something he knows that I don't, because he seems to not be worrying about these things than I am.
It's well, I like the ambiguity of both the ends of that, and I think that we can let the listeners decide. The definition of expert that I was told very early on was being an expert is reading one more book than the other guy.
That's interesting.
So,
that's interesting.
And if you've written one more blog, yeah, you're the guy.
Yeah, I've certainly written one more self-help book.
You know what? And you've got that going on. So to that end, thank you so much for joining us to be the expert on moral scrupulosity today.
Happy to do so.
All right. Well, so we'll talk for the itinerary for today for everyone listening. We'll talk a little bit about what moral scrup is, how it shows up, some telltale signs that maybe it's infecting or impacting the way that you think and interact with the world around you. And then we have a question from a listener about kind of a moral theme. So I'll read that, and then we'll kind of go over maybe what this person might think about, do, challenge. As a way to start overcoming this fear or kind of getting a new relationship with it. So
sounds good.
So Jon, tell us a little bit about what moral scrup is, why it fits, why it's a subtype of OCD, and how everyone listening can eradicate it forever out of their minds.
Well, as you know, you can't eradicate it forever because, concern with your morality is part of what it's like to be a person. We say with OCD, right, it's like you learn to accept that you have unwanted thoughts and that's okay. You're supposed to have unwanted thoughts. They're just not supposed to control you. But I think with morality, it can be such a huge thing. It's even defining it. It's like you can define it in so many ways. So usually the way it's defined, I think it's appropriate, is kind of an alternative to religious scrupulosity, right? Mm-hmm. So that word scrupulosity, you think about religious scrupulosity. So these are people where their OCD seems to go after their faith or their faith tradition, and the focus is very much on what if I've sinned, or what if this is a thought that's not allowed in my religion? What if I'm not practicing my religion perfectly? So you could have the same relationship with a higher power that you might have with society at large, right? So what if I took the word God out and I just replaced it with, my community or society or the world or something like that? So am I participating in society the right way? Am I valuing the right things? Am I behaving the right way? Do other people think I'm behaving the right way? Would I be rejected from society if they found out that I thought these things or felt these things or did these things? So moral scrupulosity tends to be like that. Similar to religious scrupulosity, it's taking something small and making it very big and the kind of focus of your functioning. But it's in the context of, am I a good enough person? So then there's that idea of being good enough, which we were talking about before we started this, which is, a lot of OCD is like that. Did I wash my hands enough? Did I lock the door enough? Am I sure enough about this thing? So it would make sense that it would also apply to, am I a good enough person? Have I thought through enough my self-worth? And then there's even broader than that, which is just, what is it? It's sort of I think when you live with OCD for a certain period of time, mm-hmm. it's undertreated or it's not treated at all, you start to develop philosophical problems, right? You start to think things about the world or yourself that make it very difficult to function, like I'm bad, right? I'm not good enough, or I'm not lovable. And a lot of the treatment, even if we're talking about ERP and CBT, is kind of breaking down some of those philosophical problems that are getting in your way so that you can just sort of be.
Well, first off, thank you for that definition. Yeah, we often hear moral scrup kind of tied to religious scrup, and there is this idea of perfectionism. Am I enough? But who is that in relation to? Is it in relation to society or to God or to yourself? And yeah, it's tough to kind of pull those apart for that person to see which one is the offended party here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a little more complicated than it's just religious scrup for atheists, right? It's more like if you look at other kinds of OCD, the decision not to do a compulsion, the decision to say I've washed my hands enough, or I don't need to wash my hands in this situation, right. Or I've given enough attention to whether or not I just hit someone with my car, I'm going to move on. Mm-hmm. Or, really kind of think of any kind of OCD you've ever heard of, mm-hmm. the decision to leave well enough alone and move on almost always feels like a moral decision.
The values choice.
Yeah,
Is this
exactly.
right enough?
Yeah. So am I making these decisions in the right way? And also, who am I to even decide? Right. It's almost, sometimes you see this a lot actually in Moral Scrupulosity, a kind of underlying fear of narcissism, right? Who am I? What makes me so special that I can decide, that it's time to move on? Why should I judge my own common sense, right? That feels arrogant and selfish. And it's ironic because just like someone who is let's say an excessive hand washer because their OCD tells them they're never clean enough, they're going to wash their hands so much that they're going to scrape away the protective oils from their skin and it's going to crack and they're going to bleed and they're going to get infected.
An infection, yeah.
Yeah, right. And so the very thing that they're afraid of is being caused by the OCD. And if this underlying core fear of being, selfish and narcissistic and thinking about yourself all day, well, that's also what happens in Moral Scrupulosity. You become completely absorbed with matters of the self. And you forget to just, enjoy a meal or a conversation, and you kind of relent and let yourself just be.
Right.
That's what I love about treating OCD. I mean, any kind of OCD is that when people start to really make progress, they start to just let themselves be, right? They let themselves just sort of experience life as it arises. And, this is a nice song. End of story. I'm enjoying the song. End of story. Not all those pesky philosophical details.
And do you think that philosophical question is built into the human experience? Or is there something unique or something is in the resolution of this? You're kind of saying, I'm just going to let myself be. Is that letting go of some intrinsic part of being human?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that, when I'm saying letting yourself be, I'm kind of referencing mindfulness, and I don't mean that we are expected to be that way all of the time. It's more of, do we have access to that space? Can we come back to that space? Can we wander off, get absorbed into a movie or a story or a song or an idea? And then, when we've had enough, come back. Is there an anchor point to come back to? And that point would be just being. But you're correct, right? It is the human nature to think and to come up with stories and to wander off and to wonder. And so we don't want to get rid of the human condition. We just want to, soften it a little bit. People with OCD have a tendency to, pay more attention to details that it seems like other people are just disregarding as junk mail. And so they're distracted a great deal of the time. We get to help people be less distracted.
Yeah. It's tricky. I always find moral scrup trickier than perhaps religious scrup. And I know that a lot of people would find that reversed. In a sense, religious scrup, you can go back to a book, you can go back to a tradition, you can go back to something that says this is kind of what we do. But with moral, there's as you kind of pointed out, who defines what's right? Well, and it varies. It varies from culture to culture as well. It varies from situation to situation. And a lot of times, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think you could also make the argument that the presence of a book that says, well, here are the rules. Anybody could obsess about, well, maybe I'm not interpreting the rules correctly, right? So them being written down isn't always as helpful as it would appear, right? Well, I've met that person, yes. Yeah. But I agree. Morality has a certain abstract nature to it that's a little bit more challenging. And that's why I think the treatment of it is more relational and less, go practice doing a bunch of scary things and you'll habituate to that fear. It's something more along the lines of maybe taking yourself this seriously isn't helping you or the people that you care about. And how do we find ways to just lighten the load a little bit on how, where is it written that you have to know how good a person you are? Mm-hmm. Right? The fact that it's not written anywhere should give you a little bit of freedom. Yeah. The way you're describing this, it's self-compassion treatment sounds overwhelmingly important to someone who's going through this. Kind of saying that this level of stress you're putting yourself through to try to be right, perfect, is at the end of the day unhelpful. It's causing you more stress, causing you more pain. And kind of the example of that hand washing person, it's probably going to be causing some of the problems in your life. So to let go of some of that is a self-compassion move to no longer heap this pain on yourself. Well, ironically or not, self-compassion is the exposure therapy.
right? If you think about it, right, the unwanted thought is maybe I'm bad in some way that's unacceptable. And the compulsions are various forms of self-criticism, self-deprecation, self-punishment, self-analysis. And the worst thing you could possibly do is let yourself off the hook and maybe deal with the uncertainty that you've gotten away with something. Those are the scariest things to do. So self-compassion sounds nice, it sounds like a nice thing, but it's actually pretty terrifying to treat yourself the way you might treat somebody you care about, when you have moral scrupulosity.
Right. And I think that self-compassion for a lot of people can be confusing, especially when we hear self-reassurance isn't the way to go, right? It's compulsion. You're trying to tell yourself that you're fine, that you're okay. But I think a lot of people, when they hear self-compassion, they think it's telling yourself, I'm okay. I guess, could you go over, maybe briefly, what is the difference between a reassurance and the negative, the bad one, and a self-compassion statement?
So I would make the argument that self-compassion, although it sounds nice, is really just honest. It's intellectually honest and objective, right? So when you are calling yourself a jerk, or the worst person who ever lived, or a bad person, or whatever it is, the kind of labeling and name calling, it's not objective. It's not. It's that's just how does the dude put it? That's just your opinion, man. Objective would be to say I'm having thoughts about being not good enough. I'm having thoughts about being a jerk, or I'm thinking I'm not so great. I'm feeling guilty. I'm feeling like I'm not a very good person. Okay, that's objective. Let's start with that. That's called mindfulness. That's just calling things what they actually are instead of being lost in their stories. And then the next thing would be to recognize that not only are you not entitled to the answer to the question, but you're also not that special. You're not that important, right? Other people feel doubt, other people feel fear, other people feel anxiety, other people feel less than. So if that's what you're feeling right now, yeah, that's right, because that's what it's like to be a person. People feel that way sometimes, especially when they're thinking about being bad, right? And if you might not have noticed, but I just covered 2 of the 3 components of Kristen Neff's self-compassion, which is mindfulness and common humanity, right? So then the third component is the one that people get kind of frustrated with, which is self-kindness, because it just sounds like, I don't deserve to be kind to myself, or, be nice to yourself, give yourself a hug, that stuff. It's kind of gross. So when I think about self-kindness, again, I like to think about being objective. What you tend to be doing when you're criticizing yourself, compulsively or otherwise, is looking at things through the lens of I should have known better. And I would argue that that's not possible. You did whatever you did in the moment that you did it because you knew whatever you knew at the moment that you did it. Just so happens that upon reflection, you've decided that you're wrong, but that's a different problem than thinking you should have known better. That's impossible. And so it's kind of a waste of time. I should have known better. What would be a good use of my time? That's the question you should be asking. What would be helpful now? What would be useful now? So you're ruminating about something, you think you hurt somebody's feelings in a conversation 3 days ago, and maybe that means you're a bad person. All right, so ruminating about that's not going to be helpful. Calling yourself a jerk is not going to be helpful. Thinking I should have known better than to talk to that person that way is not going to be helpful. What would be helpful? Sometimes the answer is, some kind of traditional exposure-based thing, I don't know, writing a script or telling yourself, yeah, maybe I hurt this person's feelings or whatever. Sometimes what's helpful is practicing some kind of centering or rain meditation or something like that. Sometimes what's helpful is just taking the risk of saying, yeah, I'm just going to drop it. I'm just going to not go there. And if I notice that I'm there, I'm going to drop it again and again and again, like a hot potato, until my brain gets the point that there's no more work to be done. And all of that is self-compassion, right? None of that sounded particularly nice, but it's positioning you to do what would be helpful for the person that's suffering. And that's you.
Yeah. I could see moral scrup being especially susceptible to shame. That maybe someone justifies that compulsive process because of a sense of shame, just not feeling like they're good enough. So I don't deserve self-compassion because I am just garbage. Yeah, so a CBT therapist might call that emotional reasoning, right? And I don't deserve self-compassion because I am just garbage. Well, you also don't deserve
an answer to the question that your brain is coming up with, which is, why did I do that thing? And what were my intentions? And, how am I going to make sure it never happens again? Those are things that people want, but we don't really get them, and we're certainly not entitled to them. So it's okay to be uncomfortable about it. The shame is there because the door is open for the consideration that you're a bad person, right? Guilt is when you feel bad about something that you did, and shame is when you think you're a bad person. That door doesn't have to be open at all. You don't have to actually consider it. I know that sounds very scary because it's like, well, what about the people out there that we know are really bad? Shouldn't they self-reflect, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not talking about Hitler. I'm talking about you. I'm talking about, like, you're just a person, right? And no, you're not perfect. And yes, you're going to make mistakes. And so I think it's true that when you get into these very heady kinds of OCD, you start to convince yourself, darn it, I should be able to figure this out. Well, no, you're not. It's not available to you. You're going to have to come up with another way of dealing with the fact that you're not sure if you did the right thing. And the shame is there because, that part of that is the OCD trying to push you to try, even though it can't be done, right? In the same way that it pushes you to try to make sure your hands are 100% clean. Part of that also comes from, your parents and your culture and your past. I know it's a little bit taboo to talk about psychodynamic therapy or relational therapy on a show about OCD. I mean, God forbid we talk about where people got their ideas from.
This will be the last time Jon Hershfield will be on the podcast.
That's it.
No, go ahead.
You're no longer welcome here. But I do find that when I'm working with morally scrupulous people, there's it's more than just random intrusive thoughts and then they're mishandling them and being compulsive about them. It's very much intertwined in the essence of their being, which you can't disconnect from their past. I see an extraordinarily high number of people with moral scrupulosity of trauma histories who developed core beliefs that they're bad because it's the best explanation for why somebody who was set up to love them decided to hurt them.
Yeah.
Can't think of any better explanation than that, and then you're stuck with it in adulthood.
Right. And in these situations, for let's say this person, where do you start working on the OCD first? Do you start working on the trauma, or is ultimately that going to be intertwined and going to be worked on together for this person?
I think in psychotherapy in general, you want to look at the whole person, right? And then you want to look at what behaviors are impairing them the most immediately. Sort of start getting involved with that and pay attention to what it does to whatever other things there might be. And a lot of times, certainly in more severe cases, you have to work on multiple sides at the same time. You have to do the dance between the OCD and the trauma and the depression, for example, and the substance use disorder, right? You can't say like, well, keep doing your drugs, but I'm going to just work on the OCD. Sometimes that means referring out. I mean, I'm spoiled because I work in a residential program where we have a multidisciplinary team, and I can kind of design a team around, all of the problems at once.
Yeah.
But sometimes what you can do is sort of, okay, in the immediate term, this person is, let's say, engaging in specific rituals, certain types of avoidance. They're asking reassurance in a very specific way. And that part of it is really just OCD. So if we can work on that and start really working on some response prevention there, let's see what happens. So then what happens, let's say, with somebody who has co-occurring trauma, the trauma starts to come up and take center stage. So while you're holding the OCD down, you can then perhaps address some of the trauma. And you find that, again, it's not like they're these two completely different conditions. They're different versions of them, they're different demons. One has horns and the other one has, wings or whatever, but you can work on them at the same time. Yeah.
What's interesting is as you're describing this, I think this, maybe in OCD land, we hear a lot about, have to accept the uncertainty, have to push into that feared thought. Maybe that's, that's an older way of thinking, but especially with this conversation about moral scrup, I hear a lot less of embrace the possibility that maybe you're a bad person as the forefront, and that's more of an afterthought.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. I mean, I think again, whether you had OCD or not, you have to accept certainly that through somebody's eyes, you're just unacceptably bad. Right? I mean, I could just, as a maybe this isn't appropriate for the podcast, but like, you can edit it out later or not, I'll let you decide. But like, as a non-believing Jew, there's still places in the world I can't go to without being looked at as a demon that needs to be destroyed. Right? And so when you think about what that really is, right? Like, anybody at any point could be looked at from one angle and just be identified as unacceptably bad. Right? And so usually people with moral scrupulosity aren't worried about, well, what are people going to think about me in Afghanistan, right? They're thinking about what are my neighbors going to think about me, or that sort of thing. Yeah. But fundamentally, you have to deal with the uncertainty that however it is that you've concluded it's time to stop beating yourself up, there's that room for that possibility that you got it wrong, and that, you know, maybe you're not in the eyes of whoever you care about, so great. Yeah. But I agree with your point that I tend to shy away from things like kind of overt exposure scripts about, you know, being a terrible person, because they tend to generate a lot more depressive mood stuff, and it ends up just kind of devolving into self-criticism, which is really kind of the compulsion that we're trying to get rid of in the first place. And yeah, I think while I would still say uncertainty acceptance for the win, maybe not leaning so hard on that idea of like, well, maybe you're a bad person, maybe you're not. It's more of like, maybe I haven't assessed this thoroughly enough, or maybe I or not. Right. So Reed Wilson talks about this, the generic sense of uncertainty as opposed to the content-oriented sense.
And there's no test we're ever going to be able to do that's going to tell us, you know, what percentage bad we are versus good. Right. Yeah. We're never going to be able to, you know, do some assessment and it's going to say, John is 75% good, which is very good. Kevin,
I mean, it's enough to pass your licensing exam. So.
That's true. That's true. So it's an answer, as you said, we're never going to get. So getting into that cycle is ultimately just going to be a useless process. And there's almost this mix of just us as humans. We aren't going to be, I mean, whatever that perfect enough is, that voice will always say, yeah, but there's always that one more thing that you could do. You could be a little bit more perfect. And, you know, shouldn't you, as a good person who's striving to be a good person, shouldn't I put in that effort just to do that little bit more? Because isn't that what good people do?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what good people do. I mean, that's an idea. Perhaps that is what good people do. I mean, how would I know? How would you know? I mean, I think this is the problem, is that we make these assumptions. A lot of the OCD
good.
boys.
That's pretty damn good.
Like, what's that? 75%? Yeah.
You're 75%, and that's up there.
Well, I mean, again, you know, it's not going to get me into good college, right? It's not that's not the GPA of morality that's going to get me. You know, what's that?
How good were your parents at that college? Never mind. Yeah. Legacy good. But I think to your point, though, it's kind of like, why would we even indulge that question? Because there's no answer to that anyways. And is it serving you?
Point I'm making. Trying to answer that question is not the best use of your time. And one of the ways to look at morality is to really consider what is a skillful use of your time and attention. Right. Whatever it is, whatever tradition you come from, you could at least agree. We could all agree that there is a time between birth and death, and this is this time, and you can use it in a lot of different ways. Mm-hmm. Right. So is this a good use of that time? Right. Is trying to answer that unanswerable question a good use of your time? I mean, exploring the question, like, what does it mean to be a good person? I think that's worth some amount of attention. Mm-hmm. You're going to give it so much attention that you can't stand to be around your own children, or enjoy a piece of art or something like that. I don't know. That doesn't seem well thought out to me.
Lose sleep over reading philosophical books, or watching every YouTube video, or asking your friends whether or not they think that this was a good decision or a bad decision.
Oh yeah, I've seen that actually. I've seen patients come in with stacks of philosophy books, and it's if you enjoy that sort of thing, if that's interesting to you, that's cool. Go for it. But if you're doing it because you have to, because you feel like if you don't, it means you're not a good person. I mean, you could be out planting a herb garden or something. It seems like a better use of your time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, sounds like there's a lot of personal values acknowledged in this. That trying to move towards a more kind of to that ACT language is like, is this thing that you're doing getting you closer towards your goals, or is it getting you further away from it?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So I know we could talk a lot more about this, but we have a question. Shall we go over the question now, or is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, it's your show, man. I'll follow your lead.
Well, you're the star of the show today. People hear my silly voice all the time. Okay. So, where is it then? Oh, and you know what? I'm totally going to mess it up because I don't know the name of the person who sent it in. So no named person, I apologize, but I'm going to read your question. So if we're all ready, and I'm going to stutter and it's going to be awkward. Here we go. Question goes thusly. It says, I'm part of a Facebook group for Christians battling anxiety, and I posted this. Here it goes. Does anybody else struggle with anxiety about doing the wrong thing morally? It can be such that even the tiniest thing can bother you. Like, I don't want to make a single dishonest penny on my job. And if a customer drops a coin and there's no way to reach them, I worry if I'm in the wrong for picking it up. On a larger scale, as a divorced man entering the dating realm again, I worry that making a mistake morally with a girl and I worry about making a mistake morally and going too far. I'm taking precautions such as when I have her at my place to never have the girl over if I'm alone, and likewise never be at her place if we're going to be alone. That could open us up to temptation. That would be too much. But I can get super anxious about this. I really think I have an oversensitive conscience. Anyone else? They said, someone recommended your podcast. Which episode should I listen to cover moral anxiety and issues like this? Well, listener, caller, writer, this one. This would be the one to listen to.
Well, no name, if that's your real name. First, I mean, it seems obvious that some of the moral scrutiny is shaded by by the religious tradition, yes. Right? So there are concerns about what is appropriate behavior religiously, and that is bleeding over into how. And I think I referenced this before. It's like, how do you cope with the moral ambiguity around your own ability to decide if you know how to follow your religion? Like, who are you to decide? Right? Because again, in moral scruple land, you're not allowed to be selfish, and making this decision for yourself is an act of self-absorption, isn't it? So it's very difficult. A couple of things that came up for me as you were reading that description was so the anxiety about doing the wrong thing morally. So this is how the moral scruple gets you. It positions you as different from other people, special, and entitled to a heads up that other people don't have, meaning people without OCD. They just aren't aware that they need it, or the way people with OCD become aware, like, oh, I need this thing. I need to know for certain, right? Because the answer is, it's impossible, right? You have your faith that guides you, and you have your basic common sense that guides you, and you have your personal experience that guides you, and then you take a step and another step and another step and another step, and that's called walking. And what are you going to walk into? Oh, you don't get to know that. Is it going to be some wonderful relationship and your future and a great job and love and kids, or is it going to be a crosstown bus? Like, you don't know, and that's what you have to learn to live with, and that has to be okay. That's life. It might sound really scary, but if you don't open up to this idea that you're not really the author of this story, and the next page is going to turn, and what's written on it is not for you to see. It's for you to read. When it's there, you go, oh, this is what's happening now, right? It's the same thing with like health anxiety, right? What if I had this disease and that disease, right? But if you've ever known anybody who got a disease, they got it, and then they're like, oh, now I have to deal with this, right? It wasn't part of their plan. There wasn't like, and then when I'm in my late 40s, it's just, that's what happened, right? And there was no expectation, really, that they could have planned all that much for it, right? They could have maybe taken basically good care of their health in the hopes that kept it from happening, but that doesn't even always work. And so you can try to be a basically decent human being and still find yourself in a situation where someone accuses you of doing the wrong thing, and maybe you even see their point, because maybe you made a mistake, right? I mean, what is a mistake? It's trying to do the right thing, and then upon reflection, concluding that you were misinformed. But people talk about, particularly morally scrupulous people, talk about mistakes like they're these things that should never happen, that only bad people do, right? So anxiety about doing the wrong thing morally, what's causing that anxiety is this assumption that it's a thing to be figured out as opposed to a thing to be experienced. The idea being that if it turns out that you made a moral misstep, you have to cope with it somehow. I'm sort of channeling a little bit of John Grayson here when he talks about the worst case scenario and the uncertainty tolerance and coping with that possibility. And I would agree with that. Not that you necessarily have to focus on that possibility.
And devising a plan for every potential outcome.
Right. But if it comes to pass, imagine being able to solve the majority of your problems somehow. This has become my favorite word. When I say I'm working with people with generalized anxiety who are worrying about, what about this and what about that, what if you're going to figure it out somehow? Imagine that being like the answer to all of those questions. How am I going to handle it? Somehow. And imagine actually having the confidence that when somehow comes around, an idea will actually arise that is useful and helpful because, you're a basically competent human being. And that's part of being self-compassionate too, is like making some assumptions that you've made it this far and, maybe you're not the complete fool that your OCD says you are. The other thing that really stands out in what was written there is this idea that he's setting up avoidance markers to make sure that you're not led into temptation to do the wrong thing. And in this case, the wrong thing might be sexual behavior before marriage or something that violates his religious beliefs.
Right.
And you know a lot about scrupulosity, so you can maybe help me bring this one home. But what I'm thinking is the whole point of resisting temptation as a virtue is that temptation is everywhere. And if you are positioning yourself to avoid all possible temptations, then resisting those temptations is not really all that impressive, right? It's like, look at me, I've murdered no one. I haven't left the house in 10 years, but I've killed nobody. That is not as meaningful, right? As I've been out in the world and a lot of people have made me mad and challenged me, but I've always approached them with kindness.
And I felt that feeling, I felt that urge, that pull, and I resisted that urge or that pull.
Yeah. So I'm not advising this person necessarily, if it is indeed in their faith tradition not appropriate when dating to be alone in a room with someone you're romantically interested in, that's fine. But if it is, if that is allowed in your faith tradition, and the reason you're avoiding it is because you're afraid you'll do the wrong thing, a couple things are happening there. One is, I think you might actually be violating your faith in a way, because you're supposed to actually be in the presence of temptation and cope with it in a pious manner. You're not meant to be living underground, right? And the other is, you just on the sort of cognitive front, you're setting your brain up to think that you're incompetent. You're not incompetent, but who needs to do that, right? Somebody with a long history of impulsively sexually assaulting people should definitely not take that girl back to his place. Not yet. Not after a lot of work, right?
Because, and to that end, that person has a lot of evidence and experience to show that in the face of that temptation, they don't have the strength to resist it.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
And I'm willing to bet this person has the strength.
Yeah, I think that, and if they're uncertain about that strength, and they would like to be more confident in that strength, then they have to do exposure for that. That's how we build confidence. We do the things we're afraid of, and we learn to trust ourselves, right? Right. And you see this across the board with OCD, right? The problem with reassurance seeking isn't that nobody should ever get any reassurance under any circumstances. Nothing like that. It's just, if you're excessively asking for reassurance, what is it you want your brain to think of that? Right? What rational conclusion could a brain possibly come to about this? Who needs constant reassurance? People who don't know things, people who aren't competent, people who have no ability to guess or reason. They should be asking for reassurance all the time. Are you really that person, or are you just afraid and your OCD is bullying you?
I might be wrong.
Yeah.
I might make the wrong step. I've referred to this as future use problem. I think that's kind of
future use problem. Yeah, I like that.
That's kind of like what you've talked about with, like, we're going to put off finding this decision until we're there. Like, we're going to figure it out somehow. That's future use problem. When you get there, you get there.
Yeah, future you has a lot of problems. And
Yeah.
I think this has been my anecdotal observation. You can tell me if you've noticed it as well, Kevin. For patients with moral scrupulosity, they worry a lot about being a bad person, but they actually tends to be the opposite, right? It tends to be that they are very sensitive, very compassionate, and that they are overflowing with empathy, right? When they're around somebody who's sad, they're just like drowning in that person's sadness, right? And they're around someone who's anxious, it's very uncomfortable for them. So that sounds like it could be pretty cool, but it also sounds like a little bit of a liability, right?
Sounds
like overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
So I think that a part of what happens here when you're talking about the future you problem is that they consider the future you, and people with OCD are very good at coming up with stories in their head and actually kind of viewing them like movies, so it can feel very real. And they picture this future you, and this future you is being criticized and run out of town for being a bad person, and they feel badly for future you.
Yeah.
So a lot of the compulsions are driven to protect future you. So when you say, well, that's future you's problem, I think that's hard for people with moral scrupulosity, because I don't want future you to have problems. And they start to feel the pain of this version of themselves that doesn't exist yet, and then try to protect it. And that's where a lot of the compulsions come from.
Yeah. And you've referred to, in a previous time you were on, talking about the difference between confidence and self-confidence. I don't know if this is language that you still use in your practice, but you kind of talked about, being self-confident, that ability to know that you can generally do it. You have the skills, the abilities to work things out. Kind of that maybe you can figure it out somehow. And
whether or not it goes your way, you'll be able to navigate it.
No, yes, yeah. And then the confidence, kind of general, saying something to the effect of things can work. I can work through this, and things, to a certain degree, can work out. Now, maybe I'm misunderstanding that. That's perfectly fine. But it's kind of like we're not looking for certainty. We're looking, we can build that confidence within ourselves, and that's kind of what I got a sense again of what you're talking about of, someone who needs that constant reassurance. They don't think that they don't have that self-confidence that if things were to hit the fan, they'd be able to navigate that in a effective, meaningful way. So they just think they're going to crumble. So they need that outside scaffolding.
Yes, and you actually you made me think of another aspect of your listener's question, which is when you're consumed with these thoughts about, I need to be certain that I'm doing the right thing, and I need to protect my future self from the shame that will come if I had done the wrong thing and was led into temptation. You're not thinking about is that girl that is on a date with you, and what it would mean to her if you were to invite her to your place or go to her place and be alone with her and make her feel special and make her feel loved, right? Your OCD is painting this very dark and sinister, picture of like you're going to lose your mind and, do the wrong thing, violate your faith, hurt somebody or whatever. And while you're worrying about all of that, you're not thinking about how can I make this other person happy, and what is their experience with me? What would it be like for them to know that I trust myself around them, that we share the faith, and that I trust them around me. And so the OCD makes this argument that the good and moral thing to do is to, avoid that situation. But you could also argue that the good and moral thing to do is to not avoid that situation. That's what's so maddening about moral scrupulosity.
You can make both those arguments, right? And I think maybe for this person, it is going to come down to making ultimately a choice, and knowing that choice is going to work out the way that it works out. And we don't know exactly how it's going to work out. When you were talking about, taking away all temptation, I was thinking like, all right, we got to make sure that everybody dresses modestly. Don't show anything. And that's where that like, ooh, I see some ankle. Ooh, that's what was coming up in my mind.
You're an ankle man too, I take it, yeah.
Who isn't? So I think the listeners learned way too much today. But it's...
No, but you're right. I mean, avoidance doesn't actually decrease anxiety in any meaningful way. It gives you maybe like a temporary stay of execution with your anxiety, but it's setting you up to believe that you can't handle the thing that hasn't happened. So if the thing does happen, you're going to go into it with a lot of anxiety because you already believe that that you can't handle it. And so all the avoidance of temptation that you're talking about, I think also you're correct. It sort of translates into the mind thinking that it's starving for temptation because you're withholding it as opposed to dealing with it appropriately.
Right. Yeah. And within that level of temptation, I think there's, we're kind of stepping into both worlds, and we haven't talked about the coins issue, but, ultimately I would say just pick up coins. Just pick up all the coins.
Just pick up the coin. Send me the coin. Here's my address.
Send the coin. It will cost you more to ship it than to keep it. So keep it, or do whatever you want with it. Stick them up your child's nose.
You must get those things in the mail for, if you donate to something like, Save the Animals or something, and then you're on their list, right? So then they start sending you a lot of things, right? Holiday cards and posters and calendars and stuff in the hopes that you'll donate again. And I always marvel at the cost of some of these things. I got something in the mail the other day. I'm not making it up. It was just $3 bills. Like, here's $3, and won't you please give us another 100?
Keep your dollars.
I don't know what to do. They're actually they're sending checks now. Like, this is something like the $3. Okay, I'm gonna pocket it. Maybe buy some candy for my kids or something like that, right? And but they're actually sending checks now. Like, pay to cash, right? You could take it to a bank and deposit the $2.50 into your account. And the walk of shame to that bank and away from that bank, they understand that very few people are going to do it, right?
They misunderstand the helpfulness of just take a picture of it on your phone through the Bank of whatever app, and it's deposits right there. Shameless.
No, I can take the dollar bills, but I can't get myself to deposit the check, not even mobile deposit. It just seems like going too far.
You know what? We're all making moral decisions.
That's right. But that falls within my 75%,
There you go. And you know what? That 25% is rough. But I mean, all right. So I think there's something to be said about acknowledging this person. They said they know they already have an oversensitive conscience. I think they can say they've acknowledged that. I think there's some Catholic traditions that have that term, having an oversensitive conscience, as something to say, they are going to feel that feeling a little bit higher, a little bit harder, and kind of taking that into account, knowing that as they go into these situations, their anxiety might be up. But it doesn't mean that they've done something wrong. It means that the alarm system is a little more sensitive, perhaps, than another person's. But they can still act, I want to say rationally, they can still act consistently with their value system, whatever that might be. I don't think it's unheard of for, let's say, a conservative religious person to, create those boundaries of, I'm not going to be alone with the opposite sex. I've certainly heard that, and that is a choice. Yeah. But if your worry is, sexual immorality, you can get on in the car outside. You can have sex on the bench outside in a park. It's possible. People do it. I'm not saying this person has to do it to overcome this anxiety.
And the point that you're making is all these safety behaviors is not guaranteeing the safety.
It's not guaranteeing. So at the end of the day, it still comes back to there's a line that I need to draw. And is my boundary building serving me, or is it just causing me more distress?
And the moral challenge is, do I have the right to trust myself and love myself enough to decide where that line is? Mm-hmm. Right? I'm going to recommend yes. But
I like that recommendation.
That's the question. That's the question that I think a lot of people struggle with: is who am I to make this decision? Right? They might be operating with some very distorted beliefs. I'm nobody. I'm not smart. I'm not worthy. Right? I need somebody else to tell me where the line is drawn. And I think that's a problem. I mean, if you're talking about having a sensitivity to morality, if you had any other kind of sensitivity, you would have two basic options, right? I mean, it could be like a physical sensitivity or any other kind of sensitivity. One would be to try to toughen up, right? To strengthen that part of you that's sensitive by exercising it. And that we would call that exposure therapy, right? Put yourself in these morally ambiguous situations. Look at that coin on the floor and say, well, I'll take that nickel, maybe I'll donate it or something like that, but I'm not going to go running down the street looking for the person who dropped it. So one option would be to strengthen the part that's overly sensitive. The other option would be to soothe yourself when your sensitivity is being revealed, right? If it's very sensitive to cold, it's so you put on a jacket, right? And you don't beat yourself up and say, I wasn't meant for this cold world, So I think we have to do both of those things in life. We have to find that balance between taking care of ourselves, soothing ourselves, understanding our sensitivities, and strengthening whatever part of it we're capable of strengthening so that we suffer less. All of this comes down to suffering less.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting, as you were talking about this, I was reflecting on this earlier. I had Jeremy Schumann on in an episode previously to talk about neurodiversity, and we were kind of talking a little bit about this element of recognizing that maybe we're oversensitive to that cold, right? A traditional OCD therapist would say, we just got to get in the freezer and suck it up and deal with it and build that muscle. Or it's acknowledging that sometimes we feel cold in this area, so can I put on a jacket, but let that be as far as I'm willing to make it go, rather than having to say, I have to have fires all around me and I have to have the heater up to 90 degrees or just live in Southern California.
Right. If you want to go to a social event and you really value that event, and it's just going to be in like a cold environment and you're sensitive to the cold, right? You could not go, but that would really be a great way of dealing with that, right? And go and wear a jacket. And then, you might also work with like, is it possible to tolerate maybe a little bit more of the cold than you think, because you're so used to focusing on the self-soothe side? Not that you're going to stop having this sensitivity or that you have to torture yourself with it, but can you pay attention to some of the thoughts you're having when you notice that you're a little bit cold? If your first thought is, I can't handle this is going to go badly, right? Then you're catastrophizing. Can you slow it down a little bit? Right. It sounds very trite, but it's, the solution to all of this OCD, and in particular moral scrupulosity, is take better care of yourself. Mm-hmm. And what you hear from a lot of people with moral scrupulosity is, I can't do this, I can't do that, I'm avoiding this, I hate myself, and the only thing I can think to do is beat myself up. Well, that's not working.
All right, so let's come up with option B.
Yeah. So how can you take better care of yourself? And, how can you do exposure to your fear of narcissism by thinking about yourself, but in a different way? Because remember, when you are letting the OCD keep you hostage and putting you in that hole, you are denying other people your awesomeness. Other people probably want to get to know you and want you in their lives and care about you. And then you're like, I'm bad. And they're like, but I don't care. Be my friend. No, I'm not good enough to be your friend. But that's not, what about that other person and their needs, right? So you can think about yourself in an absorbed sort of way that also allows other people in.
And not as a guilty way of saying, you are depriving other people. Look how terrible you are for depriving other people of your presence and awesomeness. We're not giving you more things to worry about. But anyways, that's all part of it. I know that you've got to get out of here, so I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about your experience, your knowledge about Moral Scrup, and to answer this question. If people want to learn more about stuff you're writing, where can they find your information? Where can they find more about you?
Well, you can always go to ocdbaltimore.com, which will send you to our Shepherd Pratt page. It shows everything that we're doing here at our clinic and the outpatient and residential, and has links to all of the blogs and things like that. If you want to follow me on Instagram, the handle is OCD Baltimore. You can see my musings and memes and stuff on there. And they are very amusing and memey. So thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.
All right, Jon. I'll let you go here. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, be good to yourself, Kevin. Thank you.
I'll do what I can. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for making it through that episode. Again, I love every conversation when Jon Hershfield joins. He offers just a great perspective on how to treat OCD, ways to start viewing yourself in relation to your thoughts and in relation just to the world around you, as in a very humanistic, compassionate way that I think can be just wildly beneficial for anybody who's struggling with OCD and anxiety disorder. So I will always jump at the chance to have him on. So thank you all for joining me for that. So if you have any further questions about Moral Scrup, go over to fearcastpodcast.com and you can ask me more questions about that. If I get enough questions, or if I get any questions, I'll reach out to Jon and see if he can give us another hour to talk about, or give us any amount of time to talk about this. And hopefully we'll be able to do that. So send over your questions to fearcastpodcast.com or over at Instagram. All right, everybody. Until next time, or if you, excuse me, let me jump into the end of this for real. Getting ahead of myself. Everybody, please remember that the Fearcast does not substitute for psychotherapy. If you need a little bit of help in your recovery, go over to fearcastpodcast.com and click on the Find Help link, and there'll be some information for you there. So, until next time, take a risk, challenge yourself, and don't take your brain too seriously. Bye.